Hello viewers, today we are going to talk about sexuality. We are going to try and understand how was sexuality incorporated as a subject matter of social sciences. And in order to understand, we have to first try and figure out why sexuality studies and understanding of sexuality in social science began as late as the 1960s. That for the longest time, social science, sociology, was not interested in questions of sexuality. Now, the reason why sexuality was not studied in sociology or in social science was very similar to why gender was not studied, because both gender and sexuality, they were thought to be aspects of our biological self. So because it was associated with biology and sociology or social sciences were interested in society, they thought that one does not need to study sexuality. And all kinds of understanding of sexuality was based on assumptions of natural biological makeup. So aspects of our sexual behavior was simply explained in terms of biological or evolutionary theory. There was no attempt to try and understand our sexual behavior in terms of social as a social phenomena. For instance, if I were to give you an example, you see there is this general understanding that men are more promiscuous than women. Women are sort of more loyal and men are more promiscuous. Now, biological explanations of these kinds of ideas emerge from, for instance, the understanding that a man as a biological species produces many more sperms than a woman produces egg. And because the man produces more sperms, he's more invested in being able to impregnate more women, whereas the woman is, because she has to carry a child for 9 months, is not then invested in sexual behavior in the same way as a man does. So you see that the entire domain of sexuality was then being understood in terms of the biological imperative of reproduction. You will also notice here that there is an attempt to foundationalize only one kind of sexuality, which is heterosexuality. Right? That biologically as a species we are supposed to propagate, and as a species men and women have to come together to reproduce, right? But this is how biology tried to understand sexuality. If you look carefully, uh, in human society, sexuality is just not about reproduction. If we look at the present time, you realize that there is a lot of conversation around sexuality, and we don't simply today think of heterosexuality as the only normal form of sexuality. We have a range of new kinds of expressions and identities whereby people are talking about different forms of sexuality, different forms of sexual behavior. So it is in this context that I'm going to talk about how sexuality became a part of social science analysis, right? So the first thing that any social scientist who's trying to understand sexuality would claim is that, of course, sexuality is a social phenomena, right? So how do we think of sexuality as a social phenomena? The first most important thing to understand when we are trying to understand sexuality as a social phenomena is that it varies. Because if something is biological, we tend to think that it is universal, it does not change. But if you look at the way in which our sexual lives have been organized from one society to another, you would realize that there is a lot of difference in the way in which our sexual lives are organized. And it is precisely because sexuality has varied across space and time that social scientists become interested in the phenomena of sexuality. I'd like to give you a few examples. For instance, until before the 1860, there was no conception of what we today call homosexuality. In fact, the word homosexuality was coined only as late as the 1860s. Prior to that, we only had a conception of what is normal sexual activity and what is abnormal or carnal sexual activity, right? And abnormal sexual activity basically meant anything that did not involve a sexual relationship between a man and a woman, right? So in this context, there was this criminalization of what is referred to as sodomy. Sodomy was forms of sexual penetration other than the penovaginal penetration. Now, this was something that was criminalized throughout the 18th century. Right? Now, from the late 18th century, you realize that a new word emerges, which is homosexuality, which talks about a new kind of sexual desire, which says that there are particular kind of people who have a very different kind of sexual desire. Of course, at this point, you will realize that homosexuality was seen as a perversion. It was seen as something which is a kind of disease, a mental aberration, even associated with criminality. Right? Now, if you now come to the present moment, you will see, for instance, in United States of America, in the early part of the 21st century, you now actually have the institutionalization of gay and lesbian marriages. So you see, in a span of 1.5 century, there has been so much change that has happened. What we thought as completely abnormal, unacceptable, suddenly emerges as something which is now endorsed by the state itself. So that gives you a sense that there is something about sexuality which is also socially organized, which is about the state, which is about law, which is about how the society produces our understanding of what is acceptable and what is unacceptable. Right? So if we then try to understand how sexuality has transformed, we will automatically have to see how sexuality has transformed as a social phenomena and not as a biological phenomena. Because this change, for instance, that I talked about, thinking of homosexuality as a sin, as a disease, as something that is criminal, right? There are still countries which do the same, right? Which exist simultaneously. And there are countries now which also give them respect as any other normal form of sexuality. So this tells you that it is not simply about biology, but it is also about social phenomena. And hence, whenever sociology or social sciences try to understand sexuality, they begin with this very simple submission that sexuality is social. It is not entirely biological, or it is not entirely medical. And in order to develop this further, what I would want to talk about is use the idea of sexual scripts in sociology. Now, sexual scripts is the understanding that in society, we are all learn to become sexual in particular ways. We learn to sort of behave, act in particular ways on the basis of our sexuality. We learn it in our families, we learn it through media, etc. So what we have is that we get templates of behavior. These templates or these normative templates are called sexual scripts. They may be private scripts, which is, how an individual basically works around the issue of sexuality. They may be historical scripts, which is at a given point in history, how is sexuality being understood. And in order to understand the way in which these sexual scripts have been transforming, I will try and specifically concentrate on the way in which notions of sexuality, of love, of desire have altered through the 19th and the 20th century, particularly in the West. If we look at what is referred to as the Victorian age, now during the Victorian age, very interestingly, in the domain of sexuality, the idea was there was a kind of decoupling or a separation of love from sex. And there was a very clear-cut understanding that people have sex within marriages, within heterosexual marriages, and sex is solely had for reproduction. In fact, the Christian ideas of lust being a sin actually played a role here, where the relationship between the husband and wife was seen through a prism of love and not desire. In fact, there was this idea that the relationship between the husband and wife should actually be a spiritual relationship more than a sexual relationship. Sexual relationship was necessary for procreation, but not beyond that. that. So there was a suppression of the pleasurable aspects of sexuality through the Victorian age, right? And it is in this Victorian age, any other form of sexual expression was seen as sinful, was criminalized, as we can see in the context of homosexuality, etc. You had a whole body of knowledge termed as sexology, which was nothing but a classification of a range of perversions, things that are, and by perversion, you see, the very word had a negative valency. The idea that if you were doing anything other than being a good Christian within a heterosexual marriage, you were basically committing a sin or you were abnormal, unnatural. Now, these ideas began to change in the early part of the 20th century, where in the context of marriage, a new thing began to emerge. What happened was what scholars like Stephen Seedman refer to as the coupling between sex and love. So now what happened was sexual activity became an expression of love, and romantic relationship was cemented through regular sexual activity through which a couple could derive pleasure. Now you see how suddenly in a matter of decades there is a wholesale change in how we thought of marriage. So earlier in marriage it was about spiritual love, and sex was necessary for procreation but had to be avoided, to sex becoming an important cementing factor for the maintenance of a happy relationship between the married couple. Now Stephen Seedman explains this through what he calls the sexualization of love. So earlier, during the Victorian age, love was seen as a more spiritual emotion, right? But through the early part of the 20th century, it appears that love has been sexualized, where the expression of love is through certain kinds of sexual pleasure. Now, when there was a link between love, romance, and sexual pleasure, Stephen Seedman talks about another concept, what he calls the eroticization of sex. So here what happens is that we move from this understanding that sexuality is all about reproduction to an understanding that sexuality is also about pleasure. Right? So when sexuality becomes about pleasure, it becomes about self-expression. It becomes about individual desires as well, and not just the compulsions or the biological compulsions for the reproduction of species. So this eroticization of sex then had very far-reaching consequences for sexuality in the Western society. Now, what exactly happened? So initially, as I told you, all sexual activity was supposed to take place within monogamous heterosexual marriages, right? And then it became a part of love, and now it became a part of self-identity. Now this is very interesting because from after the Second World War, the understanding was that individuals may want to participate in sexual activity not simply to reproduce but for pleasure. And also the understanding or that why should sexual activity or sexual pleasure be linked only to marriage and monogamy. So because of the eroticization of sex, seeing sex as something that can bring humans pleasure, these kinds of changes began to happen in the domain of human societies, particularly in the West. And as you may very famously know that, the 1960s is a period of a kind of sexual revolution where there was a condemnation of reducing human sexual expression to monogamous marriages. At this point that you also see that there is a range of sexuality rights movements that emerge to actually argue that heterosexuality is not the only normal form of sexuality, but there can also be many other forms of sexuality. And that it is about individual pleasure, and to seek pleasure is not abnormal. And one need not always seek sexual pleasure from within marriages, from monogamous institutions, right? Now, simultaneously, as you will see, while there is a challenge of thinking about sexual activity beyond the limits or the ambit of family life and a marital relationship, at the same time some very interesting developments, particularly through the wholesale endorsement of the right to women's body, etc., through the feminist movement, a lot of new changes begin to emerge. One is very importantly the constant development of contraceptives and contraceptive technologies for contraception. Now the moment you have contraception, you're actually able to clearly separate sex for reproduction and sex for pleasure, because when you have contraceptions in place, you're basically saying now that people can engage in sexual activity without the desire for reproduction. This, of course, became particularly important for the acknowledgement of women's desire and women's sexuality, because for the longest time, one did not talk about women's desire and sexuality at all, and it is the feminist movement who began to talk about the issue of female desire and female sexuality, because there was always this double standard, and this double standard, you may also argue, emerged from these biological explanations, that it is men who desire, and women are simply the objects of desire. So all this began to be challenged when human society began to recognize that we attach meaning to our sexual activity. It is not something that we are hardwired to do simply because we are trying to reproduce. And it is then in the 1960s, it appears like a breakout moment where suddenly social sciences realize that they have to understand the dynamics of sexuality in society, because there was a lot of flux in the context of sexuality. You did not simply now have, this formula that has heterosexuality is normal and natural and everything else is abnormal, all other forms of sexual expression, be it bisexuality, homosexuality, are problematic. All these began to be challenged, and hence sociology had to then grapple with the questions of how our sexual lives are organized in the family, in the state, in educational institutions, in particular ways, right? So it is in this context that sociology tried to study sexuality. So one of the first ways in which sexuality has been studied in sociology is through what was referred to as sex surveys. The most famous, of course, sex survey is the Kinsey sex survey, which was conducted in the middle 20th century. And here the idea was to basically ask people questions about their sexual lives. Now, you have to understand that for the longest time, and even today, we think of our sexual lives as private, as a matter of individual taste and preferences. And there is, of course, a discomfort in talking about sexuality because, even in the Western societies, I mean, although they are more permissive societies, there is still a discomfort in telling all the details of your sex life. But so when Kinsey, he tried to do this study, he received obviously a lot of censure because they thought that this is absolutely vulgar to actually try and study the sex lives of people. But he eventually did study, and he spoke to around 18,000 men and women about their sexual lives. And what he realized was that there is a huge difference between how we conceive of what our sexual lives should be like, how we should behave, and what kind of sexual practices we should emulate, and actually what really goes on in people's lives. And there is a huge gap in terms of, so a lot of statistics in terms of, the incidence of homosexual activity, the incidence of prostitution, the prevalence of masturbation, the amount of sex outside marriage, etc. All of these, the statistics showed a very different picture of American society from what a Christian society would try to imagine. And I keep referring to Christianity, keeping in mind the fact that these are predominantly Christian societies, and a lot of the kind of sexual norms and regulations that actually emerged from Christian doctrine, which actually see marriage as a holy sacrament and which endorses monogamy in a certain sense. So the issue of trying to understand sexuality in sociology began with these sex surveys. And however, by and by, this missing revolution of sexuality, the fact that sexuality was not taken into account, has led to very interesting accounts of the sexual behavior and sexual identity of people. And I'm specifically going to talk about now the importance of the kind of work, critical work that social science has done, which especially to forward the domain of sexuality rights. So as I had already mentioned, that from the 1960s, you see a rise in a range of sexuality rights movement. The idea that people have a right to a certain kind of sexual identity, that to not be heterosexual is fine, that the state must not criminalize heterosexuality. So, in this context, a lot of study began to be done by scholars who were trying to understand how is it that heterosexuality came to be constructed as the dominant and the normal form of sexuality against the criminalization, against rendering perverted all other forms of sexuality. So these kinds of studied, which involved ethnographic studies, survey research, etc., was a way to try and understand different kinds of sexual experiences through access to people's sexual experiences, their telling of sexual stories, and a way to understand that if people have different sexual identities, they're not necessarily criminal or abnormal, but it is just another choice that they are making. So, hence, you see, uh, interestingly, the study of sexuality in social science has always had a critical edge. The critical edge being that it is not simply about an understanding of how sexuality is social, but it has also got engaged in some senses with the whole issue of the advocacy of sexuality rights, to think about greater sexual freedom, particularly for those who have been denied sexual freedom throughout history, whose sexual lives have been regulated and dominated in a large way by society. So mostly, sociology, social science has laid a lot of emphasis on trying to unravel how women's sexualities have been regulated, how queer sexualities have been regulated and criminalized, and at the behest of one dominant form of sexuality, which was continuously being produced as the most normal form of sexuality. So today what we see is, because of the kind of knowledge that has been produced in the domain of social sciences, that these knowledge provide a kind of, it's a symbiotic relationship with activism that is taking place at a global level to recognize different kinds of sexuality. You see, I mean, if you follow news, if you read about sexuality, you realize that often you come up with new words and new kinds of identification. Now, the idea is that it's not that, one is inventing new forms of sexuality. It is that these kinds of sexual expression, these kinds of sexual identity, the desire for certain things, the prevalence of certain kind of practices were always there, but they were closeted, they were hidden, they were stigmatized, they were in some instances the fear of violence kept them all underground, right? And now these words are a way to not only render them visible, but also create a culture of acceptance of sexual difference. So from thinking of heterosexuality as the only normal form of sexuality, I think sexuality studies has played a very important role in human societies, a critical role to emphasize the importance of sexual difference and to create cultures and to advocate for cultures which make space for sexual difference. Thank you.